So welcome to another Simplicity of Logic. Today we're talking about evidence. Now, today we're focusing on the idea of what is good evidence and how to use evidence for fact's sake. Because even myself, you can't deny that people always have agendas, meaning they will use evidence to support their own arguments. And it's only by understanding that you are a biased creature that you actively then look at the opposition views and also incorporate them into your argument. And maybe and hopefully, if you have the understanding that you are a biased creature and knowing that you should be looking at the evidence for evidence sake, maybe you could even shift your point of view because the facts and the evidence points that way. So let's get into it. Now, first, as always, I would like to give the opposing view to what I believe. So the first one is, of course, as I alluded to before, evidence is very fluid. It's very relative being to each person. You know, a piece of evidence can be to one person a fantastic and good idea, the other to another person it'd be completely horrible. One show of this example that you can have the same test, and one side will use the evidence to say that, look, an example, smoking is good for you, and the other will say no, smoking is bad. It just shows that how come the tobacco companies were able to keep publishing these scientific reports that said that, look, actually smoking was good for you, and for so many years. And that is because of evidential bias. Any piece of evidence, if you just cherry pick, just like a speech, at certain point you can say anything about a person or the idea as a whole. So in that way, one can argue that evidence is never real, because what a person decides to take in of a study and not take in, or even supposedly, like there was a test whereby the scientists had tested, but what happened was that in the end he found out that a lot of the test subjects were from a certain strata of society, and it was a social behavioral test. But what it meant was that when the findings came out, and before he noticed that, he was saying that, oh, this shows that in society this behavior is more prevalent. But then after that, he said in his later years, when he did other studies, that test was not very accurate, because he did not see at the time that how many of the people were from that certain, like example, how is it, social economic group. So because of things like that, one can be very skeptical and say, all evidence doesn't equal to the truth, because you're always probably going to miss out something. So you might as well use the evidence that you feel is the most right, in a way, to reach a goal that you believe is true, based on the facts that you believe. Basically, evidence for a goal and to push your agenda, which you believe, of course, is right. Now, can't say I agree with it, obviously, but there is some sense to it, because even I can't deny that all evidence there should be skepticism of all evidence. Even something that I believe is absolutely true could be absolutely wrong. Such as if you were a medieval peasant and everything, when someone told you, like, the greatest minds in the world all said, look, the world is flat, and then the argument that if you look into the horizon, it's flat, and all of that. So in a way, to wait for too much evidence means you never come up with any goal and do nothing. So rather, you should, of course, as much as possible, look for evidence that you feel is right and righteous, and go with that goal. Push for change rather than stagnation, because and that's a Chinese proverb that says that he who gathers all information has no information, because it's not possible. He'll basically never come to a conclusion. And if one does think that, I don't think it's absolutely wrong, because, like I said, there is some truth to it and some sense to it. But one must also be ready to take the consequences. That you must understand that all the evidence that you take in as real and righteous also has, implications of being wrong. Therefore, if you do find it, I think one should be able to change. So basically, evidence for goal's sake. Is it right? I don't believe so. But if it is, the most important point I like to state is be ready to take the consequences. Now, my view, on the other hand, is pretty much the idea that evidence for truth's sake, meaning that there is a overarching truth that you should be looking for. Now, of course, especially in philosophy, it's extremely hard to find the truth. If it was so easy, we'll all be very happy individuals right now. And the way to look for truth, even with the problem, as I said before, of evidential bias and all evidence being skeptical to a certain extent, and I learned this in university, is to always take into account both sides. When I was doing university, I first started in finance, what I noticed was that financial papers I was writing on it, most of the time, it was okay if you just gave one side, meaning that if I was talking about the Fisher theorem or something like that, I would just talk about how good the system is, and you will give some points about, well, this person said this might not work here and there, but for the most part, it's always a large body of evidence supporting the idea, with some evidence saying, yeah, it has some flaws here and there. And that was a problem when I moved to philosophy and history, something I really wanted to do. And I wrote my essays in this format, and I was told constantly that you had to show the other side. And it was then that, as much as this is common sense, it opened my eyes to the world. Because no longer was I writing articles, like my first article I wrote in history was about the Macedonian army, how it was this and that. Then my professor came and said it was a well-written article, but you really should start saying, what is it about the Macedonians that was, flawed, and what did the other writers say about it? Rather than the writers that you just cherry pick. It was an opening idea, philosophy especially, and my mind was open then to solving, to a large extent, the evidential bias issue. Because by showing both sides, you must address them. And more importantly, in philosophy, is how you solve the opposing views that is more important than the supporting views. Because like a Socratic logic, at the end of the day, one can only achieve truth if it can argue every single opposing view. Now again, one can be skeptical and say that you can never argue everything, but the lower you get to the truth, alright, if let's say truth is here and your argument is here, if the lower you get and nearer you are to truth, the more factual your point is, because you are able to logically argue every single point opposing view against you. And if your opponents can say nothing else, just by mathematics, you can say that your truth is more likely than not, which is very important in a world where one can argue anything is not true. Now we have an election coming in Singapore, and to give one idea of this example, minimum wage. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't think minimum wage is a good thing, but that doesn't mean that when I go to vote, that I have not listened to any of the arguments for minimum wage, and that I just, the problem with elections is people just put up one view, people just, cherry pick articles, and here's the thing, a lot of those people say they're very logical, they're very fair, but they keep sharing on Facebook or whatever articles which only support their view. And even they do share the opposing view, it's maybe like 8 shares of supporting evidence for the party they want, and 2 about the opposing. Even when they share the opposing view, it's lacking most of the time. And so people like that, as you can see, they can say they're fair, but their actions itself show hypocrisy, because can you say you're fair if you show 8 evidence for this and only 2 of the opposing view? It's pretty lopsided. And so if you want to be biased, just say you're biased, But if you're doing it for evidence sake, there should always be some kind of a balance to the evidence that you give. Another way to solve the issue of evidential bias and to look for good evidence is not to look at the problem, but to look for the solution. Very famously, our founding father of modern day Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, always said that there's no use looking at the problem and arguing the problem. The most important thing you should do always, first thing, look for the solution. Can you solve this problem? If you can't, scrap the idea. And I think that's again, we use the minimum wage issue and all that. That's the big thing. A lot of people want to argue the problem, meaning that, look, people are so unhappy, people are not earning enough, they're not keeping up with inflation, wage and all that. And so we should have a minimum wage. But more importantly, is the solution. If you impose a minimum wage, who has to be taxed? How much people will be affected? And answer truthfully, how much would most of the people have to pay? Naturally, like, give solid pieces of evidence to the issues. You see, by looking at the solution straight away, you're getting to the truth. Because if I was, example, trying to solve a problem on does God exist, we won't be going into that. But let's say argument is that, and I keep arguing that, well, we're debating the problem. The problem being that these people who don't understand, let's say that God exists or doesn't exist, But instead, if I were looking for the solution, I'll be looking for facts. Are there facts that show that God exists? And if he was an omnipotent spirit, let's say, what evidence show that he does, or he is or not around? You see how much more better the solution issue comes up with, rather than the problem one trying to attack other people. Another point is, with the day of the internet, it's very easy to find information. Extremely easy, Anyone can be a philosopher. Last time, if you wanted to point out something, you literally had to go to a library and look for a book with a bibliography, and then you can say that, look, I read this. Today, on the internet, anyone can say anything. And websites spout all kinds of information, saying like top 10 richest people. Where do they get this information? It's not even stated on many websites. And that is another way to get good evidence. Look at your sources. Can it be traced? The problem, like say, with a lot of the things that people share and all that is, they will share something as fact, but their articles and all that are on gossip websites, or sites that basically state a view and say, look at this, but when you look at, is there any link to an article and all that, it's either the article is literally from decades to years ago from the issue being argued now, or there is no bibliography that you can go to. When my professor was teaching me, he always told me that, evidence, one reason why they do not allow Wikipedia, because a lot of people will even argue, privately he argued that Wikipedia is a good thing. It's fantastic information. But the reason it cannot be allowed is because who's checking it? Because everybody, when they put out something, has an agenda. On top of that, the fascinating I found out was that the reason why newspapers usually are not allowed as evidence unless they link where they get the information is because newspapers, when they were started, are not bounded to tell the truth. Now, argument is because newspapers are supposed to show you something that's happening along as it happens as soon as possible, meaning that they, unlike journals or scientific journals and mathematical journals, they do not wait and find out whether this is true. What they do is they tell you, well, it looks like this person could be the murderer. Alright? So this is how actually gossip papers get away with so much stuff without being able to be sued sometimes. It's because they are telling you, look, this is truthful to what I saw as a journalist. But it doesn't mean it's true. So that's the thing about newspapers. They're bounded to tell what they feel most likely is the truth. Alright? Rather than the truth. And then comes another point of how you look for good evidence. In today's world, in a non-corrupt government and all, something that you can submit to a court or a medical or philosophical or any kind of academic journal. Alright? Something with checks and balances. And that's the way I do when I ask people evidence. If that piece of evidence can get in a court and actually get through, okay, that's cool. Again, non-corrupt government. And personal story, on one of the philosophy classes I took, she was a professor, this is a lady professor, where she said that she had one student who wrote an excellent article, or an excellent philosophical article, but she had to fail her because, here's the thing, all her facts were actually correct, and this is from a university philosophy professor. All the facts were correct, but she still had to fail her. Why? Her bibliography had basically taken all this evidence from her sister's blog, and her sister's blog, all the evidence was correct. Unfortunately, nothing was referenced to a piece of source. The sister would just on a blog say that this, but it doesn't say that this came from this book or that book. And so, as you can see, even though all the points were correct, even from someone who's very learned on the subject, it's still not good evidence, because no one can point to that blog and say, okay, look, it comes from this blog, but if you look at this book by Bertrand Russell, for example, it does state this, and Bertrand Russell is and has been argued to be a good philosopher. So in conclusion, I feel that evidence should be used for truth's sake. And the easiest way, in a very big summary, is simply always use both sides and always take into account to debate the opposing view. And don't be maliceful around it. The important thing is to always take into account that you are a biased creature, and if the opponent argues something that is, that you can't argue back and that he makes sense, accept it. No one's asking you to change your view completely, but you must give credence, like, look, your source A is a good one, I accept that view, doesn't mean I change my view. But if it is such good evidence that that is like earth-shattering, you should at least be man enough or woman enough to say that, look, you were right, I changed my views. And I think with this constant mentality and knowing you're a biased creature and all, with this active thought on self-check, like a non-corrupted government, you will actively be able to search for the truth, because you're actively able to say, I was wrong before, even in front of a crowd. So in conclusion, please look for good evidence. Please look for evidence from good sources. Thank you very much. Till next word.